So my first concern then is that if you actually go back and study the resolutions and their conventional interpretations, the article of the UN Charter 51 which was used is not a reasonable explanation. It doesn't provide justification. And Article 52, interestingly enough, says that all agencies, international agencies, which would include NATO, are bound to conduct themselves according to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. In other words, Article 52 of the UN Charter overrides the NATO Charter if the NATO Charter is being used for wars of aggression and illegal purposes. So I think it is worth going back to this, because at some point we have to hold our governments, both liberal and conservative, accountable for what they have done in our name. And if you go back to that first point, there is no legitimate mandate, at least in my opinion. And that's something I think which should be raised, given the fact that discussions about Afghanistan are pretty limited in view of the seriousness of these issues. So that would be my first concern. My second concern, a reason why I think it's very important for us to completely reconsider our role in Afghanistan and to withdraw our troops, is because we are collaborating with armies which are routinely violating international laws and international treaties, and we ourselves may be doing some of that as well. In the case of the Convention on Torture, and in the case of the Third Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, it's fairly clear that we have violated those conventions, even by transferring detainees to authorities who are known to use these techniques. And as we know, we're not just talking about transferring prisoners to Bagram Air Base or other places in Afghanistan. We know that the CIA has a vast array of what they call, or what we call, black interrogation sites. And these could be in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, God knows where else, all part of the greater Middle East area. These prisoners can be, and of course, ultimately to Guantanamo Bay. So the violation of international agreements and international law is a very serious issue for Canada to deal with as well. That also, other laws which we could be violating or collaborating with armies certainly are violating, is in the 1984 Convention on Conventional Weapons. There are a number of weapons which are either banned or seriously close to being prohibited, which have been used in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So-called thermobaric weapons, the so-called daisy cutter or bunk buster. These are horrific weapons which were used against the Tora Bora installations, which upon detonation will literally suck and burn the insides of human beings as they explode. These are science fiction weapons. And the horrific thing about it is that this is a weapon which was fast-paced for use in Afghanistan. The Americans have used Afghanistan as a testing laboratory for their new weapons, much, I think, as the Nazis did in the Spanish Civil War in 1936. So that's a pretty horrific thing to consider. Other weapons which are prohibited would be depleted uranium shells, which are made out of reprocessed radioactive nuclear waste, which have a half-life of I don't know how many thousands of years. They poison and contaminate the environment. There are also cluster bombs, which are pretty much the same as landmines, the way they detonate and violate the 1997 Ottawa Landmines Convention. It's quite possible Canadian forces have used those, but certainly British and American forces have done. Canadian forces are known to have used white phosphorus, which is a kind of almost a surrogate for napalm, except it's not napalm. And the reason that forces think they can get away with it, they insist they only use these for incendiary purposes, to light up the battlefield. But it's well known that these have been used as napalm against military, and also in Fallujah and places like that in Iraq, against civilian populations as well. And then other weapons, nail bombs, sometimes called flashettes, which are used by the British, and Hydra tungsten darts within their rockets. these all come very close to being banned weapons. And you may say, well, war is not a pretty thing. If you're going to war, you're going to use whatever arsenal of weapons you have. But we need to think very carefully before we dismiss those arguments that easily. Because this is not a country, I think, which really has a lot of experience of aggressive colonial warfare. We have a colonial past. The Aboriginal peoples can testify to that. But this is a step even beyond that. So before we dismiss the importance of these discussions about banned and prohibited weapons, we should think very seriously what they do to the people they're targeted and who's really making the money from the profit and sale of these weapons, the defense contractors and the arms manufacturers. So one of my concerns, as you can see then, is a violation of international law and failure to uphold international treaties.